We're now live, Nimi.
Okay, great. I think we'll start in about 1 minute. Okay, I'm Nimi Hoffman from the Centre for International Education at the University of Sussex. Welcome to the Sussex Development Lecture on vaccine apartheid, the TRIPS moment, and non-alignment as a form of commoning. As of May 2023, 2.39 billion people have not received any COVID vaccines whatsoever. 89% of them live in the Global South. As the UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism, E. Tendai Achiume, commented, this is a global system of vaccine apartheid. It did not have to be this way. 2 years ago, South Africa and India brought a proposal to the World Trade Organization to waive intellectual property rights for COVID-19 medical goods so that poor countries could manufacture COVID-19 vaccines and medicines for themselves, instead of relying on the charity of rich countries or being compelled to take out loans they could ill afford. More than 100 countries from the Global South supported this waiver on intellectual property rights. These COVID-19 medical goods were developed through global human efforts involving billions of dollars in public funding, thousands of scientists from all countries who freely contributed their data to a common pool, and millions of citizens who participated in medical trials. That a handful of private companies and universities in the UK, the US, and Germany could free ride on these global common goods and then patent the products for enormous private gain was an act of astonishing predation. The TRIPS waiver invoked an old principle, that goods should be managed for the common benefit of all, rather than for the private benefits of a few. Common goods are an institutional arrangement in which communities manage and produce goods through a process of collective action and self-governance. In contrast, private goods are managed through processes of gatekeeping and exclusion. This lecture is taking place with IDS, which is located in England. And England has an old history of natural resource commons that were increasingly enclosed and transformed into private property, mainly from the 1600s to the 1900s. As people lost their land, they were driven by starvation to the cities and forced to work at low wages in factories. This contributed to industrialization and drove demand for settler colonialism as a way of getting rid of angry and hungry people who were threatening political revolution. But these surplus people who had been dispossessed of land in England went on to enclose the commons in Southern Africa and East Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and North America through theft and genocide. The enclosure of the commons is therefore deeply linked to settler colonialism and genocide. The TRIPS waiver sought to protect common knowledge from enclosure by actors in the global north. But given the historical context I've just mentioned, the TRIPS waiver can also be read as having anti-colonial dimensions. Indeed, almost all supporting countries of the TRIPS waiver are also members of the non-aligned movement, which was originally formed in 1961 by newly independent states as an attempt to chart a third way between the great power rivalries of the West and the East. Although the TRIPS proposal failed, it's only the beginning of a much longer fight around intellectual imperialism and rich countries kicking away the ladder. The panel today reflects on the TRIPS waiver as an international contestation between different conceptualizations of knowledge and how this opens up possibilities for approaching the politics of non-alignment as a politics of commoning. We're very fortunate to have 4 superb experts with us from a range of institutions and disciplinary perspectives. Hyo-Yoon Kang is a reader in law at the University of Warwick. She's published extensively on law and science, legal theory, and intellectual property law. She serves on the governing board of the International Society for the History, Theory, and Philosophy of Intellectual Property, and is a member of the editorial board of the journal Economy and Society, as well as the Journal of Cultural Economy. I know her through her academic activism in support of the TRIPS waiver and a people's vaccine. Priti Patnaik is the founding editor of the Geneva Health Files, a weekly investigative newsletter that tracks power and politics in global health. In her 20 years in journalism, she has reported on global health, international trade, finance, and illicit financial flows. She's worked as a reporter in Geneva, New York, and New Delhi. And outside of journalism, she's worked at a UN public health agency. For me and many others, the Geneva Health Files has become the go-to source for careful and deep coverage of international public health diplomacy. Eka Ikpe is a reader in development economics and director of the African Leadership Center at King's College London. Her research offers a critical understanding of economic development and peace and security, in which concept building is rooted in Africa and the broader global South. She sits on the editorial boards of Africa Development, Africa Security Review, and the Journal of Leadership in Developing Societies. She's on the Research Advisory Committee of Women for Women International and is currently investigating the dynamics of biomedical manufacturing in different African countries. Peter van Heersten is a bioinformatician at the South African National Bioinformatics Institute. He worked on sequencing the first COVID-19 genome in South Africa and is an open data and open science advocate. His research focuses on the genomic pathogens that cause infectious diseases on the African continent, with a particular interest in TB and malaria, and how bioinformatics and pathogen genomics can be translated into usable and effective tools for public health in resource-poor settings. I know him through his participation in the South African chapter of the People's Health Movement. Each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes. I will then ask them some questions to get them going in conversation with each other for another 20 minutes or so. And then after this, you as the audience will have an opportunity to ask them questions and engage them in conversations for about half an hour. Okay, Hyo, it's over to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'd like to start out with thanking Nimi and the Institute for Development Studies at Sussex for organizing this and giving us an opportunity to kind of look back at what has happened, why it might have happened in the way it did, and also look forward to what this means for the next pandemics to come. So I'm just going to start to share my screen. Right. Okay, can everyone see the PowerPoint slides? Okay, great. So Nimi asked me to briefly explain what the TRIPS is, what it does, and I think also I'll say a few words about what distinguishes TRIPS, which was really instituted as part of the WTO agreement and the establishment of the institution, the World Trade Organization, in 1995. So it is very much a recent creation. And before that, intellectual property laws were governed also by international treaties, mainly by the Paris Convention for patents for industrial property and for the Berne Convention, which covered copyright. But the WTO agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights that we call TRIPS is a very specific phenomenon, and it needs to be contextualized as such, because all of a sudden, instead of the member states of a treaty having different discretion and discretionary level to adjust the international obligations to their national needs, the TRIPS was much more stringent in imposing a uniform standard of enforcement of intellectual property rights on all WTO member states. So it was a menu that was not a la carte, but it was an agreement that had to be taken almost as a whole. In the TRIPS, intellectual property rights are treated as tradable goods, And it is also enforceable under the WTO umbrella. In essence, the TRIPS agreement imposes obligations on WTO member states to a minimum standard to protect intellectual property rights. And I put the minimum standards in quotation mark because actually the minimum standards are not so minimal, and they have actually also been rather called maximalist conceptions of IP rights. So IP rights would include, and the most well-known ones are patents, trade secrets, also called undisclosed information, copyright in information, i.e. data, regulatory data would be included as well as databases, and know-how. In terms of patent law's justification, why it exists in the first place, the general idea is a utilitarian one. So patent laws have been historically justified by the idea of incentivizing innovation, and innovation is typically equated with more inventions. So on the one hand, this is the incentive function of patent law rhetoric, and it's also supposed to reward private risk by the patent holder being awarded a monopoly right of its use for 20 years. In return, the patent holder has to disclose information about the invention itself. And these ideas can be actually found in the Article 7, the objectives, and you can see in the words that I've actually put into bold that supposedly the protection and enforcement of IPR should contribute to the promotion of technological innovation and to the transfer and dissemination of technology, to the mutual advantage of producers and users of technological knowledge, and in a manner conducive to social and economic welfare and to balance of rights and obligations. As you can see here, actually all of these aims might actually not be mutually reconcilable, and one thing might not necessarily lead to another. So there are a lot of assumptions being combined in Article 7 objectives. And the principles which the objectives are related to are actually kind of broken down, interestingly, in the actual text of the agreement itself. And I just wanted to highlight that, for example, the protection of public health and nutrition, as well as developmental goals, so phrased here as public interest in sectors of vital importance to their socioeconomic and technological development, are actually expressly contained within the principles. Now, the subsection 2 is, in essence, an admission that different member states might have different needs, and therefore, discretion in terms of their policy space is also needed, in the process of implementing the TRIPS agreement in domestic jurisdictions. Now, in 2001, there was an add-on, so to say, to the 1995 TRIPS agreement, which is the declaration of the TRIPS agreement in public health, coming from the Doha Declaration on Public Health. And as we know, this was the direct result of tireless efforts of activists and of politicians on all sides in the wake of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And here we have direct recognition of the public health needs and how the TRIPS actually affects public health, access to public health, as well as dissemination of essential medicines. And this is where we see that certain kind of, the conflict between IP rights and public needs are directly recognized, and that the WTO members have a right to protect public health and to promote access to medicines for all. So this is just for us to remind ourselves that there are these kind of provisions which are supposed to balance out different interests that might come into conflict with one another. these kind of things are rather seen as the exception to the rule than the rule itself. And this is what's called flexibilities. So when you read about flexibilities in TRIPS, what is generally meant are articles relating to compulsory licensing, but they only cover patents. So this is also an issue that came to the fore during the TRIPS waiver debate in the most recent pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, that these compulsory licensings only cover patents, but for example, not trade secrets. They are not quite enough to cover all means of production, all kinds of knowledge that would be needed, that would need to be shared in order to also facilitate production without necessarily the agreement of the rights holders. And also the other problem is that they are not honored. So I think the most topical example in relation to the COVID pandemic was that Canada received a compulsory license application by a Canadian company, BioLice, which wanted to produce Johnson & Johnson's vaccine and export it to Bolivia. Canada has refused it for now, like 3 years now. So these existing flexibilities, which are the legal rights of the manufacturers to apply for, have not been honored. And there are countless other examples where the attempt to use the flexibilities have been met with punitive responses, especially on the trade side by the US. Other flexibilities are different kind of timelines for implementation of TRIPS into domestic laws. So there are the categories of developing country and then the least developed countries. Least developed countries have had a longer time to implement the TRIPS into their laws, and now it's been extended to July 34 mostly. There are also exemptions on the enforcement of pharmaceutical patents and undisclosed information until 2033, so another 10 years, as well as there are some exemptions from the obligations to accept the filing of patent application and to grant exclusive marketing rights during this now extended transition period. So when we look at what has happened since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, which was, if I remember correctly, was declared in March 2020 by the WHO. Correct me, please, if I'm wrong. Costa Rica was very prescient already in that sense that it called for voluntary pool of IP data and know-how. Interesting, a month later, COVAX was launched as part of a public-private initiative accelerator, which was supported by high-income countries, UNCP, and the Gates Foundation. A month later after that, CTAP was launched, which was very much inspired by Costa Rican call for patent pool, IP pool, and it was based on the UN Medicines patent pool, which we have had, since the HIV medication and treatment, the access to HIV medication crisis. So this is a very, very well-oiled machine. Then nothing had happened over the summer. In October 2020 was when India and South Africa proposed a waiver of all TRIPS IP protection, covering all IP rights, not just patents. And this is quite important to stress because patents are on the one hand, at that point of time, we didn't even know which patent applications were filed. So we were basically tapping in the dark, but it's essential that all IP rights would be covered because of the value of the regulatory data, the value of know-how, actually how to make these things, make the vaccines, as well as trade secrets. And they proposed a waiver of all IP rights for the enforcement for the duration of the pandemic, which in many interpretations by high-income countries was just too broadly formulated. And as you have heard before, the TRIPS is supposed to be the norm, and then the flexibilities are the exceptions. So this was a rather big exception to ask in the eyes of the high-income countries. Then the WHO responded in April 2021, so this is like more than half a year later, with the mRNA Vaccine Technology Transfer Hub. Then, and very surprisingly, a month later, the US has stated its support for a limited waiver only for patents. And then in June 2021, finally, the text-based negotiations started on the TRIPS waiver. Then more than a year later, the result that we have reached was that the WTO adopted what I would call a so-called non-waiver, which reflected mainly the European Union position, which consisted of clarification of existing so-called TRIPS flexibilities on compulsory licensing and some minor modification. So the state that we have right now is more or less the status quo of pre-pandemic. What has changed is a waiver of 31F for compulsory licensing, which is a provision that required the production of the medicines primarily for domestic use, domestic market use. So that requirement has been waived in order to facilitate the transfer of the medicines across different jurisdictions. But otherwise, it's more or less a clarification of existing provisions. And it was too little too late. I mean, it was June 2022. The pandemic had really started in March earlier, beginning of 2020. So it took 2 years and millions of deaths later to come to this rather deflating conclusion of the whole debate. Now, the questions which still remain about TRIPS and which will still stay with us for the future is that the idea of patents as benefiting the global public in the form of trickle-down economics has empirically been inconclusive, and it's not been really proven. It very much depends on the technology stage, as well as the type of the knowledge that we're talking about and the market structure around it. There was a very strong narrative against the waiver, which was put forward by member states, WTO member states, which argued that it's really up to the member states to implement those flexibilities that are already existing within the TRIPS. This was also a line pushed by the WTO Secretariat. Although it's very much well known that the policy space has been shrinking since the adoption of the TRIPS in 1995. So I think the key questions for us to keep in mind is who does the TRIPS really serve, who benefits from it, and who suffer from it. That's it from me, Nimi. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Great. Thank you so much, Ro. Pretty over to you.
Thanks so much for the invite, Nimi, and to IDS. And it's great to follow Hyo Young Kang, with whom I have collaborated in the last 2.5 years. I'll quickly share my screen. So we'll be basically unpacking the discussions. I will follow and skip some of the slides which I've had a common with you, so it'll be quicker, hopefully. In some sense, the goal of the presentation is to also share the politics of the discussions, how it impeded the discussions and the negotiations at the WTO, and really what it the state of play now and what it means, also what these discussions have meant for the ongoing negotiations at the WHO towards the pandemic accord. So the context in which the waiver unfolded, as Yo has pointed out, was, it was prescient in a sense that a lot of what came before the proposal in October 2020, we saw the what became sort of failed efforts, such as, to an extent, the ACT Accelerator and the COVAX facility and so on. And what followed, the months after the submission of the waiver was really the hoarding of vaccine doses and the failure of the COVAX facility to deliver enough vaccine doses in 2021. And then vaccine donations became like a desperate, strategy. In fact, a central piece for COVAX to ensure. And what we saw ultimately was that over 1 billion doses were wasted because some of the doses came too late to dates of expiry and so on. What continues till today also is the constrained access to antivirals and also testing. This coincided with the inception of the WHO mRNA hub, and also around this time, the pandemic accord, the idea for a pandemic accord was seeded by the European Council in the WHO. And by 2022, there was surplus production of COVID-19, and the rescheduled WTO ministerial happened in June 2022. And since then, there has been an ongoing discussion on the extension of the TRIPS decision to tests and treatments. So what we'll try to capture is, who organized it, how did it, how did they organize, how was it thwarted, and by whom? So like it's been already mentioned, the idea was to really bring a time-limited waiver only for COVID-19 and covering a swath of provisions for seeking temporary suspension for patents, trade secrets, and copyrights, among others. This was revised. The original proposal was submitted in 2020, and then it was revised in 2021. And these were the specific sections of the TRIPS agreement that were proposed, that some of these provisions would be waived. So the 20-month period during which these discussions took place really was, you had India and South Africa bring this to the WTO, essentially the citadel of intellectual property protection. There was a lot of opposition from the EU, US, Switzerland, and the UK, among others. But as time went on, more than 100 countries supported the proposal. And nothing much happened up until May 2021, where the US unexpectedly sort of indicates that they would like to engage in discussions to consider a limited waiver on vaccines only. But nothing much came of that, as we saw subsequently. And the game changer, I really think, was the counter proposal to the TRIPS waiver, which was basically EU's idea on tweaking existing rules on compulsory licensing. That basically became the mainstay of the negotiations in the following months. And then there were bilateral consultations between the EU and South Africa. And it's in sort of an anticlimax. You had the postponement of the 12th Ministerial Conference in December 2021 on account of Omicron. Then you had the DG of the WTO actually set up informally the Quad group with the US, EU, South Africa, and India. And there wasn't agreement between these four partners, stakeholders, as it were. And there was a WTO facilitated text, with the DG and other senior WTO officials that basically was brought to negotiation at the WTO. It was not something that was, endorsed by these members. And this, unraveled in some sense up until June 2022, when it resulted in a pretty, narrow waiver compared to the original proposal. And the discussions, as I said, on tests and treatments continue till today. So the problem with the EU proposal was that it really sort of drew attention away from the original proposal. It was sort of the lowest common denominator in some sense. There's a lot of pressure building on the European Commission from the European Parliament that had actually passed 2 resolutions asking them to support the waiver, to negotiate, to get into discussions. The role of Germany in shaping the EU's position at the WTO was instrumental, although you had a few other European Union countries, member states, varyingly support the waiver over a period of time. Just a word about the DG and the Quad process. I think that it is important to note that at some point during these discussions, the text was leaked, and you had additional eligibility conditions introduced initially to exclude India and China from the applicability of the waiver, and in the end it ended up becoming China in addition to other developed countries. So from my sort of limited vantage point of reporting on this, I think the actual negotiations really began in May 2022. For a long time, countries even struggled to get members to other members to discuss the text. So with 6 weeks to spare, the fight was essentially given up after a long struggle. And this this tries to capture the main actors, as it were. The proponents, of course, and the opponents. It's interesting to note that Brazil was not a supporter of the waiver. And then you had other actors against the proposal, including the industry and even developing country manufacturers, and Bill Gates with his famous statements on IP during the pandemic, and also World Bank and Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. And WHO was a very forceful supporter, and so were Nobel laureates, global leaders, NGOs, and human rights experts, and a whole host of other communities. So this was, as Hugh has already mentioned, it resulted in a limited set of clarifications on existing rules, and it sought to exclude participating countries, reduce the number of participating countries, and was only limited to vaccines. I think one of the biggest drawbacks was the fact that it excluded tests and treatments at a time when it was really necessary. This is just to show you the drama of the ministerial in some sense. This is the Indian Trade Minister holding court at the WTO at a time when the discussions were really not going well. But it's all about semantics, which brings me to just the use of the word waiver, which has been adopted by WTO Secretariat and countries such as India, for example, that this has been a successful effort, that the TRIPS waiver was passed, but it's a grave misnomer, and it is not at all the TRIPS waiver that the proponents had set out to do. And in some sense, I think even the word equity has been co-opted since. So the state of play now is that you have the discussion on the extension of this decision to tests and treatments that's on. You have the negotiations of the pandemic accord and amendments to the international health regulations, both at the WHO. And there is mention of the word, waiver-like characteristics of IP provisions in the event of a public health emergency, and so on. As far as the extension process is concerned, countries, WTO members were supposed to have decided on this by December 2022. That deadline has long since passed. They have been grappling with questions of scope, of what kind of products, what kind of therapeutics, what kind of diagnostics, and whether at all they're still arguing whether IP is still a barrier in the access to medical products, and whether the June text of what was adopted last year is it actually suitable for tests and treatments. And what's also underway is internal investigations by the US International Trade Commission that actually had public hearings on the matter last month. And is expected to come up with a report on this by October 2022. So up until then, you essentially have the US, holding this discussion hostage till they conclude their internal investigations. I do think that despite the limited effect on the ground, the waiver talks have been an inflection point overall in the access to medicines discussions. And as we saw that, earlier, hitherto, we did not really talk about trade secrets and regulatory dossiers in the way we have been talking about now, especially at the WHO. I do think that it has permanently shifted the goalposts of the debate, the terms of the debate. Countries like Brazil and even EU member states are really extensively talking about, wide compulsory licensing arrangements in the event of public health emergencies. And one could argue that it has altered the dynamics between companies and governments. And the momentum is there to really go beyond COVID-19, which is no longer a pandemic, of course, but to also set precedent for other diseases. In all the discussions on the mRNA hub and similar efforts at the local level. Hugh raised the question of the future of the TRIPS agreement. We do remember, one developed country trade ambassador telling us that, we could not have discarded the rule book. So therefore the outcome of what was achieved was very much within the confines of what has already been agreed at the WTO. And a lot of people also think that the men and women negotiating IP and public health at the WTO, are they sufficiently primed to address public health issues? These are some of the broader questions. Are they sensitive to issues of public health? And of course, we've had lots of scholars calling for the dismantling of the TRIPS agreement. And we are witnessing a greater consciousness about moving these discussions really to the regional levels as far as manufacturing and procuring medical products are concerned. We put our reporting together in this book, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Priti. Eka, over to you.
There we are. Okay, good. Thanks very much to Nimi and to all here at IDS and Sussex more widely that have had us here. Thanks also to the co-panelists. It's really fascinating listening to the conversations before now. And, I hope I build on some of what has been said. I think very directly, I pick on Priti's point about countries in the global south thinking about how to improve access to and affordability of medical products following the pandemic. And a lot of my work now is really centering that element of the conversations we've had so far. So what I'm trying to do here is rethink ideas around dependency theory and draw on the work of dependency theorists as well in reflecting on the role of the state or state capital and vaccine development and production in African contexts. And I've begun with a study on Nigeria. And as I move into the work, I think, my charge today was to reflect a little bit on dependency thought. And I'll do that here also in the way that it's influencing the work that I'm trying to do. In this piece of research. So of course, dependency thought is really rooted in the notion that what many of us that are development scholars consider, development processes and outcomes are actually very much influenced, informed, underpinned, in fact, by histories of colonialism and iterations of imperialism as well. And the consequence of that is that certain parts of the world are located in a certain position within the global economy. And you see many of us will grapple with the notions of the core and periphery, of developed and developing, global north and global south. And it's really thinking about where do those forms of categorization come from? Where are they rooted? And a lot of them draw on an idea of developed and a sense of a single trajectory. So some of the scholars that I think are very key in this conversation, and certainly this piece of research, the work of Samir Amin, who speaks quite extensively about how the location of finance and technology and the access to finance and technology, especially in relation to production, to manufacturing, to the use of science and technology to create higher value goods, tells us about the reality of dependency, the reality of the structure of the economy as core and periphery. The work of Claude Ake, and another very influential scholar in my own trajectory, is he highlights how our thinking about development, centering that on disarticulation. So how, for instance, when we talk about development in African context, it's often about what African economies can produce for the global economy, while ignoring the very consumer needs within their own economies, right? Because a lot of it is centered on how do you produce in a way that you can export and generate foreign exchange. And by extension, it's really how do you produce what you don't need, because what you need is foreign exchange. And so this idea of disarticulation and how development must be about articulation, must be about producing what you need. Of course, as we're at Sussex, I think it's important to highlight the work of Hans Singer in collaboration with, well, often linked to the work of Raoul Prebisch, where they speak about terms of trade debates and how countries, especially many in African context, for instance, that export mainly raw materials, primary products, a discussion that's familiar to many of those that work in development, in a sense, experience lower benefits as a result of doing that vis-a-vis those who export higher value manufactured goods. So I think the COVID pandemic, as we've heard already, really brings into sharp relief the realities of these global structures and this core periphery dynamic. I think my colleagues have very eloquently, made the case around the reality in terms of access to COVID vaccines for economies in the global south vis-a-vis their global north counterpart. And I think there, the question of dependence comes in when you think of technology dependence, the need for these waivers relying on these economies to agree in terms of access to this intellectual property rights to be able to produce these vaccines so that they would be accessible to a much wider base. I think I want to flag very quickly that there have been very extensive efforts, certainly on the African continent, but many other parts of the world, to address the realities of this challenging dependent development. And we saw in the post-independence period, 1960s, 1970s, major efforts towards driving industrial development through the use of industrial policies, trade policies, controlling finance, a whole range of activities. And a lot of that was, I would argue, and I think many also make that point, was challenged and cut short by the interventions in terms of global development policy, with the very I guess they're framed as neoliberal policies, and the structural adjustment programs that accompanied efforts to address the debt crisis in many parts of Africa and also Latin America. And Thandi Kankandu has written quite extensively about this alongside others. Now, these efforts to address dependency also extended to the pharmaceutical industry and efforts to expand production within that space, even though a lot of those pharmaceutical firms were themselves established through colonial capitalism, sort of outposts from the mother country, the UK, in many cases, in many parts of the African continent. So that's a point to note, but also challenged by this sort of 1980s global development policy approach. And there I highlight from my own work, thinking of sort of developmentalist policies in Ethiopia and Nigeria that continue in particular forms up until today. A final point I wanted to note here is the fact and the reality, actually, that intra-African trade actually sees a greater proportion of higher value goods than trade between African economies and the rest of the world. So this Claudake's point about pivoting to the domestic, also if we're nuanced about how we think about the domestic, from the national economy to the regional economy or the continental economy. So these are elements to sort of reflect on and to think about. But if we pivot in that way, there's merit to doing so. And we see a very different picture when we think of Africa's trade relationship with other parts of the world. So the questions that guide the sort of research I'm engaging in is thinking about the interactions between state capital and internal articulation. So state capital and domestic production for domestic consumption, as I said, really focusing on vaccine development and production, not just production. So thinking about also the science and technology that goes into these processes. The reality, and Samir may notes this, is actually that the location of a lot of finance, global finance and technology tends to be in parts of the global north. Of course, that's, we could nuance that as we think of semi-periphery locations within the global economy as well. But so another element of the question I'm trying to engage is how one addresses internal articulation while recognizing that, some of the technology required and the finance required might be located elsewhere. How does one negotiate in terms of access to that? And I think this conversation about TRIPS and TRIPS waivers sort of, make that very, very clear to us. As I said, I'm very influenced, very inspired by the work of Samir Amin, and arguments around self-reliance. And the points he makes there is thinking about centering African internal mass markets. So African markets, but mass markets, thinking of about mass needs, and centering those as a way of disrupting dependent development. Linked to that is the idea that we must consider synergies between production and consumption capabilities, and we must also think of the mass element of the population. So we need to come away from a focus on the minority is a key element of the arguments he makes. Highlights also the importance of thinking about productive forces in this conversation. So knowledge, technology, and capital, as it were. And these are important elements in this conversation about vaccine development and production that I try to hone in on as well. He's very clear about a focus on health and social infrastructure. So again, I think that gives me grounds for this focus on vaccine development and production. And as I mentioned before, this use of more modern techniques, so science and tech, to improve productivity with this focus on the broader space of society. I connect this work to work of more recent work from Machiko Nisanke, who is thinking about a sort of, again, a developmentalist logic around the role of the state in driving industrial development, industrial transformation, but thinking again of the broader space of society, the broadest domestic base. So coming away from a focus on the minority, and then thinking about domestic markets as well. But this nuanced way of thinking about domestic markets to engage the national, but mainly the regional market. And that links to a lot of reflections, I guess debates around self-reliance and delinking that question the sustainability of that approach when you think of the size of certain markets on the African continent. I'm looking at Nigeria has a very large market, but there are many other African economies on the continent that would be seen as having quite small domestic markets. So Amin engages this idea of delinking in a particular way. Now, it's often been, I guess, interpreted as pulling away entirely from the global economy. I draw on his interpretation of this as actually subjugating external relations to internal dynamics. So really about recognizing the need to continue to engage with that external space, but making sure that that engagement is actually serving the purposes of what is more significant in terms of the internal centering, the internal dynamics centering the domestic markets and domestic needs in a way that Claude Ake had argued as well. Now, reflecting on this context of delinking, and again, I think colleagues have highlighted this, where the monopolies of technology and finance are actually located within global north context, and you can say also some semi-periphery context, so we should be nuanced about this, and how that those locations, these monopolies of technology and finance actually impinge on economic, political, and social value and how that is expressed, and what it means in terms of how it diminishes possibilities in parts of the global south, in terms of my own discussion now in the context of Nigeria and some other African contexts as well. Now, it's notable that Samir Amin has been clear that there are economies located in the global south that have negotiated this disadvantage, if you like. So we must come away from a sort of impossibility argument and instead look to understand how, what pathways may actually exist. I want to highlight, because of my own interest in the role of state capital in sort of negotiating some of these spaces, linked to where Amin also highlights the significance of state capital, but only if it focuses on mass needs, if it focuses on the majority. Machiko Nisanke is also quite clear about the importance of state capital in terms of negotiating the dependence in terms of technology and finance as well as part of a strategy of transformation. And so for me, these all potentially allow me to try out a conceptual intervention that redirects the preoccupation of development discourse with the extracontinental, with exporting, that export orientation. So not saying it's not necessary, but subjugating that to domestic needs and to domestic markets, like prioritizing that, thinking about value creation and consumption in that way. And that led me to, and I present this very briefly, this is very much a work in progress, sort of, putting in elements of my thoughts that I've drawn from the work of Samir Amin and Machiko Nisanke. On the one hand, thinking about capital goods, so the means of production, if you like, thinking about those productive forces, knowledge and technology, as pathways to engaging with mass consumption. But that mass consumption is thinking about national as well as regional markets, and we can extend that to the continental markets if we think of the African continental free trade area, for instance. Now, as part of that, also thinking about the place of state capital within that. Within that conversation about state capital, the prioritization of social infrastructure is an element I highlight there. The ways in which finance and technology can be controlled, can be negotiated, where access to those can also be negotiated, by the state, for instance, the use, deployment of trade and industrial policy, but also as part and parcel of that, questions about the innovation that might arise from this focus on, or this prioritization of domestic markets. You'll see there, still note the importance of global economy interactions because of this recognition of the global economic structure, where indeed, finance and technology are located in particular parts of the world. So how might that negotiation occur? And a final element I highlight there is around global influence. So thinking about the potential benefits of this internal articulation to the globe. So what kind of innovations might be possible when development is about, or when domestic needs are prioritized in many of these conversations? Is it possible to think of innovations that might not have been possible otherwise, and the gains that might be possible then to the wider global economy? Okay, and I'll flag a little bit of this as I reflect very, very briefly on some very, very initial findings. So, as I said, it's a study focused on Nigeria, mixed methods approach. But here I want to just highlight very briefly some initial findings from some primary data that I've collated. It's still, hardly analyzed at all, but I just try to pick out some elements that might be useful for the conversation today. So some of the key emerging ideas, I try to pull together some thoughts that emerge from the data in relation to knowledge and in relation to science and technology. So on knowledge, some elements that have come out of some of the key informant interviews I had with those engaged in vaccine development and production along the lines, in terms of thinking about how technology might be accessed, in terms of finance as well, and a range of other relevant factors here. It was very interesting to see a narrative of abundance come to, rise to the top, if you like, abundance in terms of knowledge and capacity. So there was some recognition of some of the challenges of mismanagement of resources and all of that, but there was a throwback and a reflection to the sort of post-independence developmentalist Nigerian context that I referenced before, and how important that has been for the sort of knowledge and capacity that's available towards vaccine development and production in Nigeria. There was reference to diaspora successes as a way of making a case for the kind of capacity and knowledge that exists. And I think in particular, there is a case of a scientist who was part of the team that developed the Moderna vaccine. I think Professor Buago, is what it's called. I think he was based at Yale. I can't remember exactly now. But this is someone who studied in Nigeria, studied medicine in Nigeria, financed by the state. You think of the place of state capital. And after studying medicine, has gone on to be based in the US and has been part of this team. So, a lot was invoked around that experience, for instance. The importance of regional continental exchange and collaboration was also highlighted as a basis for this narrative of abundance. And the WHO recognition around this was also highlighted as well. Points were made about how this knowledge and capacity must be complemented by infrastructure and human capacity as well. So recognizing some of the challenges around maintaining and addressing this. Points were raised around the ability to access scientific and research infrastructure in other parts of the world, especially in global north context, but also some recognition of the need to think about knowledge production that's focused on public higher education institutions, even though these tend to be less well-resourced and tend to be more difficult spaces within which to work. So the final element I highlight here is sort of the science, technology, and innovation space. And very interesting to see a point highlighted around the possibilities of innovation in science and technology because of the uniqueness of African context and African contributions. So one point was made around the importance of focusing on African context in terms of, what can be achieved with African scientists focusing on African context. An element was made, a point was made here around the lower morbidity of COVID in West Africa and what that may actually signal if one focuses on that context and what innovations might arise from focusing on that context. A point was made also about how this kind of focus on this internal space generates new knowledge, and that it's important that that new knowledge isn't provincialized simply because of where it's located. Another point was made around the trust and confidence that can accompany a situation where African scientists are very focused on African context, and this was linked to sort of vaccine hesitancy and especially linked to some of the problems that have attended this space. When you think of, in northern Nigeria, major problems with Pfizer and sort of unethical behavior around polio vaccines that have meant that there's a great deal of vaccine hesitancy and north, and colleagues saying where they go to talk about, taking up some of these vaccines, some of those within those spaces want to be sure that Africans are the ones who produced the vaccines that they would be taking on. So it's very interesting to see that. Another point here was also made about access to technologies for domestic production. When you think about interactions with global North counterparts vis-a-vis those from the global South, and how there tended to be a greater openness when there was interaction with scientists from the global South. So Indonesia was mentioned in that regard, for instance. How finance is very significant and important, of course, was a critical point. And then a final point I want to make is around questions around the universality of science and the politics of thinking about global standards as a measure. So on the one hand, recognition that, this narrative about global standards might be important as a guide and a benchmark, but the extent to which that needs to be balanced with local needs and local priorities, and where that framework will actually serve as a hindrance, where it becomes less possible to center particular domestic realities, and in that regard, particular domestic needs. So let me leave the conversation there, and thank you very much for this platform today, and I very much look forward to the conversations to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Eka. Peter, on to you.
Thank you. Let me just get my screen showing up. And Eka, yeah, that was something to follow. You covered a lot of the points that I think I'm going to make. But let me just bring a perspective. As Nimi said, we know each other via networks like People's Health Movements in South Africa, and somewhat of my kind of foray from a career bioinformatician into activism, largely driven by the consequences of a lot of what the other speakers have been speaking about. But let's have a look at like the kind of landscape as we see it in Africa at the moment, right? So just putting some numbers on some of the things that Eka mentioned, that in Africa we've got 12.5% of the global population, but only 3% of the global GDP. About 0.7%. The figures are going all over the place. Some people say 0.5% of Africa's GDP is spent on R&D. And that explains also why R&D in Africa is really driven by northern research funding, the academic sector. The largest health funders on the continent, for like South Africa's Medical Research Council, just pale in significance compared to something like the US NIH or UK MRC. On average, the world is spending 1.9% of GDP on R&D. We have about 1.1% of global researchers. About 1.4% of scientific papers published in 2014 were coming from the African continent. And interestingly enough, and not that I'm in favor of our global patent system, but 0.1% of global patents. And 1% of vaccines are produced on the continent, that are used on the continent. And this is a decline. So one of the things that must be noted about vaccines, vaccine technology, is that there's been trouble keeping up with this technology in the world in general. So if we look at, for instance, meningitis, which is a particular a focus of mine in recent years, the longer lasting meningococcal vaccines are really being marketed to, for instance, US college students at price points that are absolutely unaffordable on the African continent. But older polysaccharide vaccine technologies that don't last as long in terms of the protection they afford were being produced in places like Brazil, in Cuba, and now we're seeing a shift towards a kind of concentration of really high-tech vaccines. In the case of meningococcal vaccine, that basically means protein subunit vaccines, I think, but it's being produced in a small number of high-income countries. And I mean, Eka alluded to this a little bit, but I think we have to, look at it in detail. That the so-called SAP era, the Structural Adjustment Program era of the 1980s, gutted African higher education and universities. So if we look back into, the 1970s, University of Dar es Salaam was really a world leader in a number of intellectual pursuits. Laboratory science, laboratories. And remember that this is, again, a question of basically, can you keep up with emerging technologies? So, we don't want to be still using, for instance, culture-based diagnostic methods in 2023 when molecular methods are available. But even those techniques that were available in the post-independence period, there was a lot that was lost due to the impact of the structural adjustment programs. And in my slides, which I can share with everybody afterwards, I made a link to Iruka Okeke's book, Dividing Without Seeds, which is a brilliant exploration of this process, and of course healthcare systems. So healthcare, not just in terms of healthcare, but you can't do healthcare research without healthcare systems. So you unless you want to run like some northern funded units do, run a little clinic, that's not really contributing towards the kind of mass market in healthcare products that Eka just mentioned. And then Africa is facing an extractive world economy that directs R&D and its products away from Africa. Okay, so I mentioned the meningococcal vaccines, but the innovation landscape that we're seeing that is, so for instance, one of the key technologies that we use for a number of diagnostics on the continent is CFEED's gene expert systems used for Mycobacterium tuberculosis, but also used for Ebola. CFEED is an American company that got its start in funding after the anthrax attacks in US after 2001, but has really cornered the market on cartridge-based molecular diagnostic systems on the continent. They don't have Ebola outbreaks in the United States, but that is where you have to buy the cartridges and the machines and everything from, and that is where the innovation is happening. Okay, and this extractive world economy and how Africa relates to it, we see this playing out right now in Sudan. The wealth of Sudan being concentrated in the hands of some warlords that received funding, in the case of Hemeti, from the European Union to try and so-called stem the refugee flow through Sudan. So it's the tune of more than $100 million a few years back. But that the warlords who are fighting over that country and who are destroying in the process the university systems, the libraries. If we look, there's absolutely, besides the scale of human suffering that we're seeing horrifying images being shared of burnt libraries. We know that the University of Khartoum is at the center of some of the fighting that's happening at the moment. And these things but this fighting is not coming out of nowhere, but is being driven by the relationship between mineral extraction in the Sudan and the accumulation of wealth in the hand of warlords and transformation of that into weapons, militias and armies. And this is mostly talking about the past and the present in terms of the extractive economies and the SAP era, but we also see that already climate change is devastating the African continent. We're seeing droughts, we're seeing floods. Hundreds of people died in Nigeria last year, in South Africa, floods in Eastern Sudan, in DRC, and droughts in the Horn of Africa. And this is, this is happening while Africa really is not a major contributor comparatively to carbon, to kind of global carbon production. This using some Global Justice Now 2017 figures. So they estimated about in that year that they were looking at 161 billion going into Africa, whereas 204 billion a year was being extracted from the continent. So a net outflow of finances. On top of that, 68 billion a year in illicit financial flows. So this is not counting the fact that multinational corporations, including some, that historically have their roots in Africa, like Anglo Gold, are repatriating profit out of the continent. But there's also unaccounted for money in large amounts flowing out of the continent, estimated at that point almost 40 billion a year in climate damage, 29 billion a year of illegal logging, wildlife trade, and this illegal logging and in the transformation of forests and the patterns of human habitation has a lot to do with the way disease outbreaks start. So if we look at the West African Ebola outbreak and its possible relation to increased human-forest interactions and palm oil production, and its associated bat roosts and the relationship between bats and humans, the way that transformation of the Central African rainforest is exposing people to hemorrhagic fevers and mpox, and that these things are, when we talk about like the climate damage, the logging, the wildlife trade, and all of these kind of things, these are not disconnected from the health of the people on the continent. So what does this leave us with? If we look at global scientific research output, the so-called global north, or high-income companies, are by far much more producing research output than we have here on the African continent. It almost vanishes, but then so does South America. But it is interesting noting, and this picture is some years old, but it is interesting noting the emergence of places like China in this, in the production of research papers and so on. But this is also not coming from people who've always lived in the global north. It's estimated that thousands of scientists trained in the African continent leave the continent annually. And I mean, I think with all respect to some of my amazing colleagues around the world, a number of brilliant scientists and scholars and African scholars are based in the United States, in the United Kingdom, because this is where there are opportunities to do the kind of research that people want to do, because the funding is there. But we have this picture over here is also built on not just extraction of African wealth, but an extraction of African bodies in the sense of minds that young minds that are now located in Germany, in Canada, in United States, and so on. I mean, it's to the extent that it's become somewhat of a dark joke in my field that in my field, mathematicians on the continent go to Canada. It just happens with so many of them. You've got them for a few years after graduation, and then they've got a family to look after. The funding situation is not great, and away they go. Then on the other hand, if I want to do research, I need consumables. So where are we purchasing it from? Roche, headquarters in Switzerland, Eppendorf, Germany. Of course, the sequencing companies, Illumina in the United States, Nanopore in the US, and then the various reagent companies, Thermo Fisher, Bio-Rad, etc. This means that to do science, you need to send money out of the continent. Remember, firstly, you're getting money from out of the continent because the global economy is up here in the global north. The funders are largely there, but then they're sending money to you if you manage to win a research grant, and then you're sending it straight back into a global north economy. And what are we getting here? We are purchasing, often in order to do the business of science and research, we're purchasing what I sometimes call mysterious liquids, reagents, that plasticware, glassware, that are controlled by a absolute minefield of patents and trade secrets. You know, those magnetic beads that you're purchasing from Agilent, well, all the other papers used the Agilent beads for DNA purification as well. They are a known quantity, but they are also a patented item. What is exactly in your DNA easy extraction kit? It's something. We don't know. There's trade secrets and patents mean that that this picture is largely locked down. It's it's not. We have people in the medical access will talk about the access to generic medicines. There hardly is an equivalent in the lab diagnostics and R&D world. There is no such thing in many cases as a generic equivalent for some of these things, because like and like is very difficult to prove. How do you know that this DNA extraction kit that you're purchasing from perhaps an Indian manufacturer or a South African manufacturer is actually equivalent to one that you can buy from the local branch of Thermo Fisher or Sigma Aldrich? Okay, and in order to prove that they are equivalent, remember, we're not talking about things that are registered with a regulator, like, for instance, a medical treatment. We're talking about something that simply has a catalog number. You have to spend more money doing equivalence testing at your own cost. There's no global, like, the regulatory system, or your government is not helping you, for instance, or a world body is not helping you actually figure out how to save money on your reagent costs. So the market is not small, and it's improving. I mean, it's increasing. This is just in terms of biotech reagents. I got some figures earlier today. Grew from 61 billion in 2016 to 99, nearly 100 billion in 2019. Yeah, these companies, but remember, this is an innovation system which is largely driven by public money. But it's public money from funders that have no interest in actually changing the shape of the global innovation and distribution landscape. So what do you need for health innovation? Eka, I think, went through it in great detail, but I'm just going to look at some points. You need funding, obviously, which is coming from US NIH, EU, the Commission, UK MRC, the Gates Foundation, and so on. You might recognize the Gates Foundation as one of the opponents of the TRIPS waiver. You need capital, including intellectual property, know-how, institutions, actual physical universities, samples, and so on. So, for instance, in my world of tuberculosis research, or working on Mycobacterium tuberculosis, I collaborate with colleagues at the Institute for Tropical Medicine or the Swiss Institute for Tropical Medicine and Hygiene in such tropical countries as Belgium and Switzerland. But these are holding some of the world's largest collections. In fact, I believe the world's largest collections collected over decades of Mycobacterium tuberculosis samples, which, when you want to do a novel diagnostics, or you want to look at the diversity of the bug, then you look under a freezer in Switzerland or in Belgium. There is not equivalent capital in the sense of accumulated both expertise and materials available to a researcher in Nigeria or in Uganda or even in South Africa. As I mentioned earlier, equipment and consumables, you're largely importing. Policy frameworks, I believe that only about half of the African continent, half of the African countries actually have science and innovation policies. But again, the policy frameworks have been impacted by the so-called common sense of kind of global innovation that basically sees, basic research happening in universities, and then you commercialize it, and that's the kind of often American-like, although the Europeans are quite good at thinking that way as well these days, ways of seeing like innovation policy. Regulatory environments, I don't have time to go into that, but the regulatory environments in terms of are often not very friendly to domestic innovation. It's very expensive to propose new diagnostics and so on. I'm hoping that this will change to some extent with the developments from the AU side, but it's not kind of commons friendly is the other thing about, like, there's, when you apply for the registration of something, then there's a lot of like secret documentation that goes into, applying for the registration of products that is not shared between applications. And of course, you educate the population, which hopefully will actually stay in the continent or come back to it at some point. And the thing is that we cannot go it alone because of the shape of the world. We cannot go it alone in Africa or in LMICs in general. There's just so much that we depend on a global scale. But that means that we need collaboration, partnerships. And this is a highly contested space. What do North-South partnerships look like? But what do South-South partnerships look like? How can we actually do this kind of development? Because where we can actually be relevant to each other from one African country to another, from South America to Africa, from Southeast Asia to Africa, and so on. Okay, then of course, how can we reduce the cost of doing research in the South? But also, when we talk about the global commons, my one concern with the openness and a lot of the open movements is that if you see them merely in terms of products, then we are having a commons on an unequal playing field. And what does collaboration mean in that kind of context? So there have been some initiatives, and I'm just going to end with this because it's really just on the starting blocks. Because of the crisis of COVID-19, the AU through Africa and CDC launched partnership for African vaccine manufacturing. It's still very early days to see what that amounts to. And there've been calls from Drugs for Neglected Diseases initiatives and various other actors for a new kind of common goods approach to health technology innovation. And I believe that in terms of the previous points about like actually, being cost effective, that this rather than everybody kind of going behind the kind of IP silos, it would be a cost-effective way to health technology innovation, but these are certain to face political opposition, not just from the global north, but also from the agents that they insert within the African political landscape. So I'm going to end off there. I think Eka had more hopeful, notes at the end of her slides than I do, but definitely another world is possible, but it is facing some quite tremendous hurdles at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, really good kind of conversation between, on the one hand, the legal and kind of sort of foreign policy dynamics of medical innovation, and on the other hand, the political economy dynamics of that. It'd be good to open this up, I guess, then to the audience. If you guys have any questions, for Priti, Eka, Peter, and Hyo. Just a note, Priti will need to leave in about 10 minutes or no, even a bit less than that. So if you have a question for Priti now, please ask it. It's a really good opportunity. We have a kind of one of the world's experts on the TRIPS waiver with us. Okay, I guess maybe I'm going to ask a quick question, but maybe to get you guys started with talking amongst each other as well. Priti, I'm kind of, you mentioned Anne Orford's call for dismantling TRIPS. What are the, we're speaking about utopian possibilities here, I suppose, but what are the prospects of this? And what can we learn from the ways in which actors in the global north managed to kind of derail the attempted TRIPS waiver?
I think that actually even academics are divided on whether we should call for the end of the TRIPS agreement. You have, for example, Susan Sell, who has suggested that we have to work within what exists, and there are possibilities such as TRIPS flexibilities and so on. But really, the issue is also about the standards, TRIPS plus standards in bilateral agreements and free trade agreements and so on. So it really depends on where you stand on this. But I think what's more important, I think, in the current context is how IP will be addressed in a trade context. And I think that is what worries, folks at the WTO and those countries that are very sort of invested in protecting IP protection, IP rights. Is the fact that, in the context of climate change and environment, how is trade and climate being decided at the WTO? So the moment you talk about waivers for intellectual property, so I think they are worried that this will go beyond health. So I think, so there are wider questions beyond health and how you treat IP in the trade context. The fact that questions like the validity and the use of the TRIPS agreement are being raised is interesting. Again, I'm struck by the fact that why should countries be slave to rules that were agreed? These are man-made rules. And if you have a situation such as a pandemic, we don't, we have to adapt to the kind of creative policy measures that the situation needs, and not show the rules. Even in the discussions, around the pandemic accord, people are talking about let's have waivers, and let's have that kind of language here at the WHO. And the same questions are being raised, that you cannot talk about waivers and you cannot talk about touching the IP system because the forum for these discussions is WIPO and WTO. So I think that there is this kind of fragmentation in the way we are looking at some of these complex challenges, such as health emergencies, and we will have to find creative ways to respond, and not sort of look at the playbook and say this is what is allowed and this is what we can do within existing rules. Sorry, your second question was on northern countries. Can you repeat that?
Oh yeah, and I guess what can we learn from the tactics that actors within the north used to derail the TRIPS waiver proposal? Well, the simple answer is the fact that there are huge, obviously, influences of corporate power, but not just that. At many different national levels, governments were co-opted.
including among those countries that were on the fence or that supported the proposal. So just to blame everything on corporate power, I don't think it's not looking at the whole picture. There are these other forces that are operating at national levels that are impinging on policy space. We had one sort of Indian expert who went into a whole lot of detail as to why the Indian government, for example, had not used existing TRIPS flexibilities during the pandemic. And as I said, that even developing country manufacturers were not in favor of talking about the waiver. So this is more complex than that. The only other thing I will mention now is, yes, northern countries played a certain kind of a role in the TRIPS waiver discussions, but the world has changed even in the last 1 year. Like I said, you have the US. US has used a lot of flexibilities while responding to the pandemic within its territory. The EU is looking at a EU-wide compulsory licensing mechanism, and they're talking about this in very serious terms. It doesn't matter. It's another thing that what they discuss internally and how it sits with their statements and positions at multilateral forums such as the WTO and WHO. So I think there is a fair bit of nuance. And even among rich countries, you have countries like Belgium, for example, quite progressive in the way they are thinking about issues of access to medicines, just as an example. And it's uneven. I would say it would be wrong to club all northern countries together. And it really depends on interests. It depends on their bilateral negotiations with, producer countries, so on and so forth. I'll stop there.
We haven't seen any questions yet. If people have questions, please just raise your hand and put them in the chat box. But maybe just open it up to a general conversation amongst the panelists. Eka?
Thank you. Thanks so much. As Preeti has to go, I had a question for her before she goes, if that's okay. Preeti, if it's okay, I wondered about because of course there's a narrative that of who runs some of these organizations like the WTO, and I wondered from you, what would you say about the fact that WTO, is being headed by Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala at this point? Would you say in how you've observed this space, of course, and followed very closely, what's been going on? Any, I don't know, any change there? Has there been? Would you say there's value in this sort of narrative around we need more from the more folks from the global South sitting in these positions and the influence that's possible, or is there that tension with global elites? Where is the allegiance? What would you? It's a tricky one, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a tricky question, and I'm a reporter, and I don't want to be shut out from.
I know.
So no, I think the quick answer is that there were a lot of expectations from the DG of the WTO, as there are expectations from DG of the WHO, and now Gavi, actually. Yeah. Gavi also is being headed by an African national. So I think that there are these expectations, but as a lay observer and as a journalist, I don't see that there has been any sort of significant change, at least as far as the WTO is concerned. Initially there were a lot of expectations because the DG came from her role even at Gavi, and questions were asked on whether she should take. She did not and could not take a position on the TRIPS waiver. But the role in the discussions and the way we saw it play out, I think a lot of African countries were under pressure, to support her positions. That's what we heard. So I think I'll leave it at that. That it has not really. I think it has not really matched with the expectations, and it's, I guess it's slightly different in the context of WHO. But in general, these institutions are being perceived as being close to the private sector, not sufficiently being embedded in democratic processes. These are the usual critiques that have been going on for a very long time, irrespective of who's at the helm. So I think there is also, I guess, a double burden for these kinds of candidates and leaders to fulfill. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Preeti, are you going to have to leave now?
Because of my constraints on childcare today, I really apologize for that.
Great. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye-bye. We have a question from Joe, Joe Westbrook. Joe says, Eka talked about the importance of local knowledge, for example, around Ebola in Liberia and Uganda. So how is this being acknowledged and used regarding possible future pandemics? And where is the World Health Organization and the discussions around waivers with the WTO?
So I don't should to Annie, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'll say from my, because in my conversations I spoke to scientists, one in particular who's part of a team developing a local vaccine in Nigeria, a local COVID vaccine. And there was the acknowledgement of the need, because I was also asking about these vaccines are available elsewhere. Do you need to do it? Are you just replicating what's going on elsewhere? And I didn't get that. The response I got was actually absolutely. There was a question of sovereignty, which was interesting to hear from scientists, actually. I'm not, as a political economist, I don't know where my head was, but I wasn't expecting that. But, really this sense of course we must. I mean, recognizing really the problems with these hierarchies, but also the innovation that's possible by looking at particular populations. Certainly, I got a lot of that. The policy side was a bit challenging, where I did hear of, and perhaps this speaks to what Peter said, where there were major challenges in actually running clinical trials domestically. So that some of those developing those vaccines in Nigeria had to go to other countries actually to run clinical trials. So indeed, the reality of what was going on in West Africa in terms of particular responses to the to COVID was then being lost. So scientists, so my own experience is that yes, scientists, at least those I spoke to, is a very small proportion, recognize the absolute significance of drawing on that knowledge and all that is possible in terms of advancements in science, but they rely still on the policy environment. So it's not just in their hands, it's also in terms of what, being encouraged, being supported to actually carry that through to its logical conclusion.
Peter and who would you like to come in on that?
Sorry, Eka, I was just got a question for you on that. So the one challenge here, of course, is going to be who funds this, because the vast majority of your funding is coming from outside the continent. So they generally wouldn't have an interest in funding the development of a Nigerian vaccine, when I think they'd probably say that, like, oh, well, we already have them. We already have vaccines.
No, Peter, and I think that's a very good point, and it's why my focus on the role of the state capital becomes quite critical, because in Nigeria, so thinking about where finance will come from, I spoke to colleagues at TED Fund, which is the research, the main research funding body, and a lot of the work that's been going on there in terms of supporting collaboration between the range of scientists that are needed to support the development of these vaccines. So a lot of consciousness around that, a lot of attention from the Nigerian state towards this. Is it sufficient? Are these funds sufficient? No. But also I was hearing about collaborations between the Nigeria's TED Fund and other funding bodies in the US, for example. But it's who's driving it, and this is the question of subjugating those engagements with external actors to what is required domestically. But I did speak to regional bodies and MasterCard Foundation, for example. There are at those levels, African Development Bank, Now, of course, what is being supported, so some of it is supporting capacity. And I say all this, but there were those that said, listen, if this science is already available, we don't need to replicate that. We should focus on production. So I drew a distinction between developing a vaccine and producing. And for some, even on the continent, the point was actually what we need is production. We don't need to replicate what already exists. Whereas there were these other questions about, must we treat it as replicating? Can we imagine a situation where actually focusing on the development might yield knowledge and possibilities that don't already exist? But how will you know if you don't try? Isn't that how science works, I guess? Yeah, thanks.
Would you like to come in?
Maybe I can answer the question about the role of the WHO and the discussions around waivers with the WTO. There is no official role of the WHO in any of the WTO negotiations. So the IP rights are solely in the jurisdiction of the TRIPS. The TRIPS, of course, is related to health issues. There have been some attempts for the WHO and the WTO to stay in conversation after the Doha Declaration, but in the recent years, there hasn't been any kind of structured space for the WHO to have a public input into the WTO negotiations. So the waiver discussion is solely negotiated at the ministerial level. So that's the one answer. But I would like to pose a question to Peter and to Eka. So what I found interesting was that the South African vaccine hub, mRNA hub, and Aspen, that they have actually, they did manage to produce vaccines, mRNA vaccines. That's what I heard. I don't know if that's entirely correct or not, but the problem seems to be that no one has volunteered to buy it, favoring, or rather already having been offered mRNA vaccines by Pfizer. So I guess, one thing is having the capacity and building the capacity. Don't know quite about the scale of what is available now, and having the regulatory framework to build a common market in such a sense that that's one thing, but also, I guess, how do you compete with those Pfizers and Modernas? So I don't know what you thought about that.
Yeah, I can jump in quickly. A very good question, and that came up a lot in the conversations we had. So on the one hand, it's like, yeah, great, we want to produce, but we've seen what's happened in South Africa. And I heard this at various levels, nationally, but also at the level of the AU, where it was very clear that the market is hugely important here. Producing alone will not suffice. And also leaving it up to the market to decide won't suffice as well. So questions about industrial policy, questions about mandating certain actors to buy the vaccines that are indeed produced came up, that this would have to this would have to be an option, especially when and there are possibilities if you think of the African continental free trade area, but we cannot leave it to the market, as it were. And this is very linked to some of what I referenced, some of the interventions that were attempted in the post-independence period around industrial policy, where particular actors would be compelled for a set period or whatever. So, it falls into the sort of infant industry protection conversation, but it was clear that without those sorts of interventions, there's potentially a challenge here if we're pushing only on the production side of the conversation. It has to be a two-pronged. So very, very valid point. And I think it's very much on the minds of most of the people I spoke to. We have to think of interventions on the market side too.
And sorry, just to clarify, so there's a couple of things. Aspen had the fill and finish thing for J&J vaccines, and there was a very unfortunate vaccine versus vaccine discourse when it came to COVID vaccines. And I mean, I believe that this was true even for scientists that were involved in clinical trials. We saw different South African scientists becoming almost partisan for different vaccine products in South Africa. I mean, so there was I don't believe that anything from the hub has entered any form of clinical trials yet. It was an attempt to kind of reverse engineer the technology. But it's actually interesting looking at what's happening with other vaccines. BioVac, which was meant to be providing the ability to scale up the work from the hub, before working on that, was starting to work on production, I believe, also fill and finish of Pfizer's pneumococcal vaccine. Recently, the South African Department of Health has announced that it is going to be purchasing pneumococcal vaccine from, I think it's Cipla, definitely an Indian company. So really, I mean, South Africa, actually, it's interesting in how Philips's history of polio in South Africa, which was really a focus because it was a white middle class disease. South Africa actually produced its own polio vaccine, and the predecessor to BioVac, the Vaccine Institute, used to exist, but servicing the apartheid health system. And what caused it to really be shut down, if I understand correctly, is just that it was cheaper to buy things from India than to manufacture your own vaccines. And I mean, it's we had vaccine stockouts before the COVID era. With I recall at one point there was a shortage of even BCG vaccines. So the question is, market structure, but also, to what extent do you fund doing something in order to have the workforce with experience for that? But it's interesting that Eka mentions the MasterCard Foundation. They're actually funding some of the work that I'm going to be working on. I mean, at the moment, Bill is funding what I'm working on. But I mean, this is, not when I'm here, talking activist stuff, but when I'm doing my kind of bioinformatics job. But before last year, I had not heard of the MasterCard Foundation, and yet they are funding some crucial infrastructure for the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I think what this whole era has brought home to me is that people need to not stay in their lanes, and that's a really tough one. So I've really benefited from knowing people like the others on this call who've introduced me to thinking way beyond what is my day job. And I'm hoping that the kind of conversations that we have in these kind of interactions, and I don't know how to encourage them. I mean, I really value those few of my colleagues like Prof. Okeke, Prof. Tamori in Nigeria, and others who make their expertise available and but also get involved in things like science and technology studies, get involved in discussions around bridging this kind of science and innovation gap. And unfortunately, even here on the African continent, we are lagging. If I look at who to me provides some of the most valuable insights into where things could be going differently, it's groups like the Treatment Action Group in the USA, whose updates on the kind of tuberculosis product pipeline are invaluable. So we really need to work harder on bridging the kind of technical gaps across disciplines between the development specialists, and the scientists, things like that, because it's far too easy to say, oh, well, that's not possible, or that's not necessary, when you don't have people who can bring the different kinds of know-how together.
I think we've kind of come to the end of our session, but that was a wonderful kind of point that you made, Peter. And I'm just going to just perhaps end on this reminder. I was in the IDS archives yesterday, and in the 1970s, there was this amazing hub of scientists across the African continent who have been pushing very, very hard for renewable energy, particularly solar energy. So they were innovating all these interesting forms of solar energy and making the same kinds of arguments that you've been making today, Eka, that you've been making, Peter, and in fact, that you've been making, Pure. And I think, a lot of that has been forgotten now, that they were driving really interesting innovation in solar energy because of the ravages of structural adjustment. I just kind of want to remind us that as we see the return of structural adjustment today, as we see the return of the conditions leading to extreme crisis and despair across the global south, that we don't forget that, and that we let the kinds of innovations that you've been speaking about, Eka, kind of really, we support them, and we continue with that institutional memory. So thank you everyone for joining us. I'm going to end it now, and the recording will be live on YouTube. Yeah. Okay. Bye.